We are doing a 9-show marathon. We start at 5, we'll go to about 4 a.m. So stick with us all night, and hope you enjoyed tonight's programming. We are excited to have here tonight, first-time guest, Tim Keyes. And I want to thank Dr. Del Size for setting us up. Tim, we were introduced to you briefly on the last program, but I'm excited to have you back tonight as your own guest and give you the mic and let you run with it.
Well, thanks, Shannon. I really appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here.
You want to open us up in prayer?
Absolutely. Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus, we are so thankful for the accomplished work of Jesus Christ. Without that, we would be nothing. Thank you for the goodness that you bestow upon us each and every day. Thank you for your indwelling presence. Thank you for your manifest presence and for our time with you and each other, extolling you in the name of Jesus Christ.
I say amen to that. Tim, we've got 50 minutes. So let's roll with it. The mic is yours. Take it away, brother.
Well, okay. So my name is Tim Keyes, and I am the author and creator of a project called God Save the King. And God Save the King is an ongoing 30-plus year investigation of the Nativity, what it really would have looked like. And to set that up, it's really just pretty simple. If you ever watch a television documentary about any biographical figure, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Wyatt Earp or whether you're talking about Genghis Khan or, pick your character. When you're watching that documentary, within the first 2 or 3 minutes, the narrator is going to say, the legend or the tradition goes like this, but the real story is a little bit different, so let's talk about that. And the same is true with the Nativity. When I started to investigate this 30-plus years ago, the fact that caught my attention was someone told me, hey, Jesus was not born on December 25th. And at the time, that wasn't really that stunning to me. I kind of took it all in stride and said, okay, well, that's very interesting, but tell me more. Why was he not born on December 25th? Or how do we know? And then as I started to investigate on my own and do my research into that, I soon discovered that, it's pretty implausible that he was actually born on December 25th. That's highly unlikely. The way I like to say it is, the chances of him being born on December 25th are 1 in 365, just like any other random day selected on the calendar. But when you track down the biblical information, when you follow where the biblical evidence leads, it just simply does not lead you to December 25th. It just doesn't do it. So over the years, though, what I discovered is that I made a minor mistake. Now, it's an understandable mistake, but nonetheless, it was a mistake, which is that when I discovered that information, that Jesus was not born on December 25th, I made the assumption that although the date of his birth changed, I didn't think it changed the story. I didn't think it would have any real effect on the story. And then as I continued my investigation over the years, I found out that just simply wasn't true, that it did change the story. And little things started popping up. Like I noticed, that in the narrative in Scripture, where we would read about certain things, I noticed that there were details that were part of the traditional story that weren't necessarily there, that kind of bugged me. And, maybe they were benign, maybe they didn't really matter at the end of the day, but they started to add up. First one, then another, then another. So let me just give you one quick example that really is probably quite benign, but we'll start there for that exact fact, which is that in every traditional nativity story we've ever seen, when it's a church production, we go to church at, quote unquote, Christmas time, and we see the nativity production, especially if it's a children's production, they inevitably have Mary riding in on the back of a donkey. And I've even seen some really excellent nativity plays where they've actually had live animals on stage. And I remember this one where Joseph leads Mary in on the back of the donkey, and she is groaning and travailing in pain because she's in labor. And at the time, it didn't really cross my mind. But later on, I got to thinking about it, and I went, wait a second, time out. Are you trying to tell me that she's in labor on the back of a donkey? Are you really? Are you kidding? That can't be true. You don't put a 9-month pregnant woman, especially one who is in labor or pre-labor, you just don't put a woman on the back of a donkey. And so that, like I said, that may actually be benign, because the reality of it is how Joseph and Mary traveled is they probably just walked is the reality. And or it's possible that she rode the back of the cart. Now, at the end of the day, like I said, that doesn't really matter all that much, but it sent me on a hunt. I started looking at other details and going, wait a sec. See, because there's no donkey in the scriptural record, right? There's simply no donkey in the scriptural record. So if the tradition is that she rode on a donkey, okay, maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But if I'm being scripturally accurate, wow, I can't really confirm that, right? So then, I started looking at other things as well. I started looking at, for example, in every traditional nativity play we've ever seen, Joseph and Mary are always turned away from the local motel by the night manager, the innkeeper, And I got to looking at the story in detail again in the scriptural record, and I noticed, wait a second, there's no innkeeper mentioned in the story. So how do we know that they were turned away from a motel? Now, we know how it reads in most versions. And I was raised on the King James. So the King James says, that she brought forth her firstborn child and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room in the inn. And therefore we assume that means a motel. And then, it dawned on me one day, well, look it up in the Greek. What does it say in the Greek? And when I looked it up in Greek, I found something stunning, which is that the Greek word for inn that we see in the Gospel of Luke isn't the word for a hotel after all. That's not what the word means. It's the Greek word kataluma, and a kataluma is a guest room. It's not a motel. Now, it's a guest room in a private home. Now, there's the possibility that it could be rented out. That is a possibility. So that's why it's not entirely wrong to translate it in, but really is, like I said, it's better translated guest room. But if you look at other records in the Gospel of Luke, for example, the story of the Good Samaritan, we all know the story. There's this man who is wounded, and then he gets passed by certain people, and then the quote-unquote Good Samaritan actually decides to help him. And in this record, we are told very plainly that the Samaritan takes the wounded man to an inn, and that he pays the innkeeper to take care of him. He says, I'm going to go away. I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks, and I'll pay you more money if I have to. So this record, it's actually pretty clear that this is a commercial traveler's inn, or what we would call a motel. And it's an entirely different Greek word. It's the Greek word pandokion, which means a traveler's inn. Okay? And then, like I said, in this record, there literally is an innkeeper who is mentioned specifically, and that's a pandokios. It's obviously an interrelated word. So when I got to contrasting these, I went, wow, this is amazing. The story is entirely different than we thought. He wasn't born in the winter. He was born in the fall. He wasn't born in a stable, I'm sorry to say, because that isn't what Scripture says. When we understand the architecture of a traditional Judean home, what we find out, now you're going to have to put on your imagination glasses here and follow along, because I'm giving you a verbal description of something that's quite visual. But if you imagine a large single-roomed house, one room, one large room. So imagine something between about, 12 to 18 feet wide and probably 20 to 30 feet long. And it's a rectangle. And then what they would do is at one end of the rectangle, they would either hang some heavy curtains or they would erect a partial wall, usually out of stone because that was the primary building material in Judea. And they would block off one end of the rectangle, and that would be the kataluma, the guest room. That would be where guests would stay. And then at the other end of the rectangle, they did something also very interesting, which is that they would dig down into the earth and create this section of the house that was lower by about 3 feet. Okay, and it would be the width of the house, and it might be 6 or 8 feet wide, and it would be, like I said, about 3 feet lower, creating a ledge of about 3 feet. Okay, and then what they would do is at that end for sure, and usually somewhere else in the house as well, they would put a door that led directly into that lowered section, because that lowered section was where they kept their household animals. Because in that day and time, in an agricultural society, pretty much everybody had some type of household animal. They had a donkey, or they had a couple of sheep, or a couple of goats, or a cow, or something like that. And then what they would do is they kept their animals in the daytime. They would take them outside, and they would tether them outside in a common courtyard or a fenced-in area outside. But at night, they brought their household animals into their house, and they kept them in the house because this kept the animals safe. They couldn't get stolen that way, and it also, in cooler weather, it would help keep the house warm and things like that. And then what they would do is, on this ledge that's created by this lowered area, that was where they would place the feeding trough that we know by the word manger. Okay, and mangers in the Near East, in ancient Judea, mangers weren't made out of wood, they were made out of stone. And the reason they were made out of stone was so that the animals couldn't knock them over. But they would be placed on this 3-foot ledge. So you can picture this in your head, that you've got a cow standing there, and he's standing on the ground in this lowered area, but then very conveniently, about 3 feet up, that's where the manger is, that's where the feeding trough is, where he can just simply lean over and eat his dinner, quote unquote, right? So now we have this big picture that tells a very, very different story. At the far end of the room is the guest room. At the other end of the room is where all the household animals were kept. And then everybody except the guests would sleep and eat and drink in the common room. Mom, dad, kids, grandma and grandpa, cousins, whoever. It just depended on how many people were in the house. Okay, so now if we add to this the understanding that Joseph and Mary were traveling to their ancestral hometown, that's extremely important to understand here. They were traveling to their ancestral hometown, which meant the likelihood that they were staying with relatives was extremely high. And if not relatives, then friends. And if not friends, Judean culture was a hospitality culture. So it'd be very easy for them to find somewhere to stay. Because this is something else I discovered in the midst of all this, is the fact that Bethlehem is a small village. Okay, it's not very big. Estimates on the size of Bethlehem is that it was most likely between about 400 and 600 people. That's it. If it got up to 1,000, that would really be stretching it. Maybe it was that big, but that's unlikely. It was a small village, 400 to 600 people. Joseph and Mary roll into town with other Judeans living in Galilee. There's a backstory on that we can talk about if we get a second. There were lots of Judeans living in Galilee, and then this edict goes out, this decree goes out from Augustus Caesar that all, as we read it in the King James, it says, and all the world should be taxed. Well, that's a little bit misleading. What it was is it was an oath of allegiance to Augustus Caesar, because the Roman Senate was planning on honoring him by declaring him pater patriae, which is the father of the country. And therefore, in order to do this, it required an empire-wide oath of allegiance to Augustus Caesar. So that's what this edict was all about, because Joseph and Mary were of the house and lineage of David. So they were from the tribe of Judah, which is the royal tribe, and they were specifically from the house of David, which meant they were royals. I mean, they lived as commoners because of the massive taxation from Herod the Great. They weren't rich, but as far as their bloodline is concerned, they were royals. And they would have had to have traveled to their ancestral hometown, which is how the Romans did it. Okay, that is accurate. They would have required you to travel to your ancestral hometown to register, not necessarily to be taxed, but to register and to swear this oath of allegiance. And because there were a significant number of Judeans living in Galilee at that time, it wouldn't have been just Joseph and Mary. It would have been their parents, their siblings. There would have been a lot of Judeans traveling from Galilee back to Judea, back to Bethlehem, to make this oath of allegiance and this registration. So you can kind of get the picture that they show up into town, and like I said, most likely they stayed with relatives, okay? So they walked into town, they went straight to the house of Uncle Moshe, and he welcomes them in. But all of a sudden, he's got how many extra people in his house? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10? Could easily be that many. How many people are already in his house? We don't know, but they don't all fit in the guest room. Somebody has already got the guest room, probably someone older, right? Give them a little privacy, whatever the case may be. But everybody else is in the common room, and it makes complete sense now when you understand this picture that it says, she wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room in the guest room. But it's a completely different picture than what we're used to. We assumed as Westerners, okay, that where you find a manger is you find a manger in a stable, because in Western tradition you do. But this is not a Western culture. This is a Near Eastern culture. This is ancient Judea, not ancient Europe, okay? And their architecture was different. Their feeding troughs weren't made out of wood, and in the stable, their feeding troughs were made out of stone, and the manger was in the living room. It's really just that simple. The manger was in the living room. And of course, this ties into an additional fact, which is that they weren't outcasts at all. We've got that fact completely upside down. They weren't rejected from a motel. They weren't alone. They were in a traditional Judean home surrounded by loving family. So it's a really very, very, very different picture than what we're used to. And I'm just scratching the surface. This is just the Judean component of the story. And there's so much I could go into here. But it's a very, very, very different picture than what we're used to. And I know for me, it really warms my heart to think, no, he wasn't born on a cold winter's night. That's not how it happened. He was born on probably a warm fall evening, September 11th, 3 BC, probably about 7 p.m., very moderate outside. When Mary goes into labor, they would have shooed all the men out of the house. They would have found a midwife, and then the women would have gathered around and helped her deliver. So Jesus of Nazareth, although he's born in Bethlehem, would have been born surrounded by loving family, which is an entirely different picture. So that's just some of the research I've done in the past 30 years, but I've also looked into not only the micro details of the story, but I've looked at the macro as well. I've looked at what were the international implications, because there's a parallel record that is extraordinarily provocative. We also are very well aware of this record. Everything I talked about just came from the Gospel of Luke. But when you read in the Gospel of Matthew, we read about these mysterious wise men from the east who showed up at the court of Herod the Great, who is the Roman appointed client king of Judea. So who are these guys? Now, I need to say something here, because once again, we are victims of our Western culture and our Western education. I use the word mysterious because we don't know that much about these men. We do not know who the Magi were because it's not in our educational system. That does not mean that Herod didn't know who they were, or that other government officials or that the population of Judea didn't know who they were. They absolutely knew who they were. The history and function and interreaction with these very interesting men from the East, because they are extremely interesting. These very interesting men from the East, that this kind of contact had been well established for several centuries. So when Herod found out that there were Magi approaching, it would have really gotten his attention, because he would have had, well, it's guaranteed he had interactions with them before. There's a very, very interesting backstory about Herod the Great, very interesting backstory about who the Magi were and the role they played, and the fact that they bring up, when you read the record in Matthew, they mention some really interesting things. I mean, we have read the story so many times that we think we get it. We think we understand it. But if you stop for a second and you slow down and you read it like it's the first time you've ever read it, there's some really interesting stuff they say. It says, wise men from the east, okay? So they came from the east, which means they came from, at the very least, what we would call Jordan, or maybe Iraq, or maybe Iran, or oddly enough, it could have been as far to the east as Afghanistan. Okay, now I think Iran is your best guess, and I can tell you why, but that empire at that time, the empire to the east, extended all the way to what we would call Afghanistan. But these wise men from the east show up. They're granted audience with Herod the Great. Now, how do you do that? Okay, so that means they had to be men of some importance, because you don't just walk into the court of Herod the Great and get an audience because you're visiting the area. It doesn't work that way. So they had to be men of some importance, okay? And then they insult Herod to his face. They say, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" In other words, where is the legitimate king? You're not him. You are a Roman appointee. You're not him. Where is the legitimate king? So, I mean, that takes some kind of nerve. Oh, my word, what nerve did they have to do that? Well, it's got to do with their, what's the word I want to use? Their skill set and what their job function was in their empire, which I'll get into that in just one second. But then it goes further and it says, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have come to worship him." And then they say, "For we have seen his star." What the heck does that mean? A star? I mean, are you talking about a star? A star, right? You saw a star in the night sky, and that told you that a foreign king had been born, and you packed up and you traveled 600 miles to engage in an ambassadorial visit to this newborn king? Is that what you're trying to tell me? Which, yes, it is. That's exactly what is implied here. But what an extraordinary story. What an amazing story. right? And then Herod's a little bit clueless. He's not exactly sure what to do here. He's very concerned about the presence of the Magi, very concerned. As a matter of fact, the whole city is in an uproar. In Matthew, it says that Herod and all Jerusalem were troubled at the presence of the Magi. So that's not just mild concern. They're freaked out by why these wise men are there. And part of the reason is because it's not three wise guys on camels. That is not what's going on here. That is a tradition that comes from the three gifts. So it was not three, it was hundreds or thousands that showed up. And I'll tell you why in a second. But then Herod's, it says he meets with them in an official capacity. And then it tells us that he met with them later in private and inquired of them diligently, when did this star appear? And they apparently tell him, because he then sets it in his mind, we know from later in the record, that he's going to murder every child in and around Bethlehem, every male child. And we have to imagine that he allowed for a margin of error, okay, that he maybe added a little bit to make sure he gets his enemy, this threat to his throne. So he sets the parameters as every male child in and around Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger, and he has them murdered. And that is just stunning and horrific. And then we're also told that he tells the Magi, after you found the child, come back here and let me know where he is so that I can come and worship him as well. Well, we know he's lying through his teeth. He's not going to go worship the child. He's going to try to go murder the child. But then we're told that the Magi, having found the young child, Jesus, by the way, not the baby, okay, the Magi did not arrive on the night Jesus was born, okay, contrary to what our nativity scenes look like, okay, because we set them up so that they can be symmetrical. We want them to look right. So you have the shepherds over on one side and you got the wise men on the other, and your nativity set can look nice and symmetrical that way. But we are told very plainly in Scripture that the shepherds found a baby in a manger, but that the Magi found a young child in a house. He wasn't laid in the manger anymore, and that's because he's about 15 months old when the Magi show up. He's a toddler. But once the Magi find him, we are told that God speaks to them in a dream to not return to Herod. So they don't. They go back another way. And we're told then that God speaks to Joseph in a dream and says, Herod is going to try to kill the young child. So Joseph wakes up in the middle of the night, and he wakes up Mary, and he grabs Jesus, and they take off and they flee to Egypt to get away from Herod's wrath. But look at these components of this picture. We need to rescue truth from familiarity, because we're so familiar with the story and we've been so used to the traditional story for so long that we have stopped thinking critically. Okay? And unfortunately, the traditional nativity story, because of my research having gone on so long, and because I have had the opportunity to incrementally change my mind over 30 years, I don't have any problem anymore saying that the traditional nativity story is Christian mythology, because it simply did not look like we think it looked. He wasn't born in a stable. The shepherds and the wise men were not there at the same time. It wasn't three wise men. It was an army of several thousand that showed up. It created a great turmoil in and around Jerusalem. The slaughter of the innocents. I was watching I got to say this. I was actually watching a documentary the other day. I happened to just kind of trip over it, on cable TV. And it was a documentary about Herod the Great. And I went, good, this is right up my alley. Maybe I'll learn something new. And so I flick it on, and I'm not really paying close attention. I had it on in the background while I was doing some other stuff. And within the first minute, they said it right out. They said that Herod was responsible for the death of thousands of babies at the slaughter of the innocents. And I'm like, that's crazy. Okay, I understand that's the tradition, but you guys obviously didn't do any research. You're just regurgitating the tradition that we've heard for all this time, and it's not accurate. Bethlehem was a teeny little village, like I said, 400 to 600 people. So how do you murder even 1,000, let alone several thousand young children, males 2 years and under? That's not possible. The number of children that Herod murdered was probably 10, 12. Maybe 20 at the outside, and it would have been horrific in the village, no question about it, but it wasn't this staggering number that we're told it was. So it's really a very, very, very different story. I've been doing this a long time, and I love telling this story because it is much more epic than we've ever understood, because once again we have to rescue truth from familiarity. We are so used to this tradition that it's just stunning. So let me shift gears here a little bit and tell you a little more about the intrigue and why this is so significant, because there's a backstory about Herod the Great that helps set the context for why he was greatly troubled when the Parthian Magi showed up, okay? Because, see, Herod was not a Judean. Herod is what was known as an Idumaean, okay? Now, that's the Latinized word for an Edomite or a descendant of Esau, okay? Now, Esau, remember, is the twin brother of Jacob, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah, okay? And, we know the story about Jacob stealing his birthright for a bowl of stew and stuff like that. But then Esau winds up being on the outs from the one true God for the rest of his history. So much so that, later on in the Old Testament, God says, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. So Herod is descended from that bloodline. He's not a Judean. Now he is practicing the Jewish religion, okay? Talk about a hypocrite, okay? Not that he's not allowed to become a proselyte, because he certainly is allowed to become a proselyte, but we have to immediately imagine that he is doing this for political reasons. But according to the law of Moses, any king of Israel has to be of the tribe of Judah and then the house of David. And Herod is neither. Once again, he is a Roman appointed, quote unquote, king of Judea, but he's from the wrong bloodline. And the backstory behind Herod, you actually got to back up, a full 600 years to get a running start. So I'll do this super fast, but if you're at all familiar with the Bible, you're aware of the Babylonian Captivity. Okay, the Babylonians swooped in and destroyed the southern kingdom, and they took all kinds of people captive, right? And then after the Babylonians came the Persians. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, and then the Greeks conquered the Persians, okay? And then when Alexander the Great died, he divided up his kingdom amongst his strongest generals, and the general Seleucus inherited the area that we would call the Middle East. It extended all the way from Judea all the way to Afghanistan, like I was talking about. And that area was so large that he could not control it. He just did not have enough men. He did not have enough manpower. He didn't have enough Greeks, because this is a Greek empire. Right? He just did not have enough native-born Greeks to rule this area, and it didn't take very long when all of the countries and empires and nations that had been conquered by Alexander started to break away and declare their independence. And one of these was a province at the far southeastern corner of the Caspian Sea. So get out your globe or get out your world map and look that up. A province at the far eastern end of the Caspian Sea. And they broke away. They declared their independence from the Greeks. And over the next 200 years, they steadily recaptured. They moved from the east to the west, and they steadily recaptured everything that Alexander had captured right up to the doorstep of Judea. Okay? Now, meanwhile, back in Judea, because the Seleucid Empire is fracturing, the Judeans actually broke away from Greek rule and declared themselves independent as well. And that happened in about 165 BC in what we know as the Maccabean Revolt. Okay, and they set up a hereditary high priesthood that ruled Judea for the next roughly 100 years until the Romans came in and they kind of took over. But after several of the Maccabean, or they're also known as the Hasmoneans, after several of the Hasmonean rulers had come and gone, there was one particular high priest who died, and he had two sons that were not old enough to take the throne. So his wife took the throne. Salome Alexandra took the throne in roughly 76 BC. She was a queen of Israel, okay? And she ruled the nation until her oldest son would be old enough to take over. But these two sons, they both wanted the throne. They both wanted the throne. So frankly, what they did is they started a civil war over the throne. And so that in these days, you had to raise your own private army. Okay, there wasn't some big national government that you could turn to for your fighting men. You had to raise your own private army. So each one of these two brothers turned to one of the superpowers in the region to make allies out of them. Okay, so the older brother, Hyrcanus II, he went to Rome to try to make allies of the Romans, and Aristobulus II, the younger brother, he went to the Parthians, which is the major empire and superpower to the east, to make allies with them. And they started a war over the throne. So Hyrcanus initially looked like he was going to be in charge. And he had a court official in his court named Antipater. And Antipater was an extraordinarily ambitious man. And while he knew that he would probably never sit on the throne himself, he figured he could probably, through political maneuvering, he might be able to get one of his sons on the throne. So that's what he was trying to do. So he was working hand in hand with Hyrcanus. He was working hand in hand with the Romans, and he managed to get two of his sons appointed as governors of Judea and Galilee. And his son Faisal was appointed governor of Judea, and his son Herod was appointed governor of Galilee. And right as he manages to do this, he's finally got his sons in a position of power where he can start maneuvering in any further. Hyrcanus and Aristobulus go to war. Aristobulus invades Israel at the front of a Parthian army. The Parthians invade Israel, and it's such a big deal that Hyrcanus and Faisal, they go to negotiate with the Parthians because they're caught off guard. They're on their heels. There's no way they're going to win. They go to negotiate, right? So they go to negotiate with Aristobulus and the Parthians. Aristobulus, according to Josephus, Aristobulus bites off the ears of his brother so he can no longer be high priest. And then Faisal either is murdered or commits suicide. Herod had actually stayed back in the rear in case everything went sideways, which it did. So Herod is faced with a decision. he can either stand and fight and probably lose, or he can engage in a strategic retreat and live to fight another day, which is what he does. Now, Herod is personal friends with the Roman general Mark Antony. So he leaves his family in the fortress of Masada with a small army to protect them, and he takes off for Alexandria, Egypt, because this is, Mark Antony and Cleopatra that we learned about in history class. He knows he will find Mark Antony in Alexandria. So he takes off for Alexandria, Egypt, but when he gets there, he discovers that Mark Antony actually isn't there. Okay, so Cleopatra puts him on a ship for Rome. When he finally gets to Rome, he meets up with Mark Antony. Mark Antony introduces him to Augustus Caesar. They realize that Herod would be the perfect client king of Judea, because the Romans want to control Judea. They want more territory and more power. So they take Herod to the Roman Senate, and the Roman Senate appoints Herod the client king of Judea for the Romans. But if you've been paying attention, Rome does not control Judea. They don't have it to give. The Parthians just invaded 6 months ago, and they control Judea. So what are they going to do? Well, the answer is the Romans give Herod 11 Roman legions to go militarily take Judea back from the Parthians, which he does. It takes him 3 years, from 40 BC to 37 BC. He drives the Parthians out of Israel, and he ascends his throne in 37 BC. And then he spends the next 36 years defending his throne against any threat. This is the real Game of Thrones, by the way, and this really happened. Herod defends his throne against any contender, which ironically includes his own sons, because even though he is an illegitimate king, he marries Judean royalty, and therefore his own children have a better claim to the throne than he does. So he is paranoid, and through the course of his career, he winds up murdering several of his own wives and several of his own sons because they're a threat to his throne. So it's in this context. See, this is why my project is called God Save the King, because it's actually a pun. It's a play on words, okay? Because Herod undoubtedly had yes men surrounding his throne. Men who would say, "Oh, great king, live forever, God save the king," because they were concerned that, he would stretch their neck, right? But so when I say God save the king, I'm planting my tongue firmly in my cheek, because I don't mean God save King Herod. I mean God save King Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, because he's a threat to Herod's throne. So this is the context of the Magi showing up at Herod's court, because they are Parthians. This is the same empire that he had to defeat in battle 36 years earlier to gain his throne. So now he's been ruling Judea for the Romans for 35, 36 years. And the Parthians, they're the major superpower to the east. He knows who they are. He's got diplomatic relations with them. It's not like they don't know each other, and they don't know how this works. They have foreign policy, for crying out loud. Okay? But when the Magi, the house of Magistanes, the lower house of Parthian parliament, okay, realizes from reading the stars that the true king of Judea has been born, they decide to make the journey to Herod's court to say, "Hey, where is the legitimate king? We've come to worship him." But you see, Judea is Roman territory. The Parthians can't make that journey except if they make that journey in strength. This is not just 3 guys on camels, like I've said. That wouldn't have worked. Herod was an extremely shrewd politician. If 3 guys on camels had showed up, he would have made them disappear quick and quiet, and no one ever would have known they would have been there. But if you're talking about an official ambassadorial entourage of Parthian kingmakers, because that's their job, that was their job in their realm, is they decided who the next king of the realm would be. The Parthians had an unusual practice in that when the king died, his eldest son did not automatically become king. It was the house of Magistanes that determined who the next king would be by reading the stars, consulting the genealogies, interpreting dreams, and then they would determine who the next king would be. And oh, by the way, yes, indeed, the king of Parthia had just died. So therefore, the Parthian Magi, the Magistanes, were consulting their scrolls, consulting the stars, seeing if anybody had a dream, and they learned that the rightful king of Judea had been born, so they engaged in this ambassadorial entourage into enemy territory to acknowledge this king, which means they would have had to have traveled with military escort. It would not have been possible for them to do it otherwise. So what they would have done is they would have traveled. I'm guessing that they came from the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, or maybe the holy city of Sippar, which is in central Mesopotamia. It's in and around the Baghdad, Babylon area, if you look at a modern map. But they would have traveled along a network of roads northwest, parallel to the Euphrates River. That network of roads is known as the Silk Road, and they would have traveled northwest along the Euphrates River until they got to the Syrian city of Rezeph, or it's also called Rasapha. It's mentioned in the Bible, where they would have crossed the Euphrates and picked up the King's Highway, and then they would have traveled the King's Highway down through Damascus, and then they actually would have stopped in Caesarea Maritima first, because that was actually Herod's administrative capital. So they would have stopped there first. But see, Herod administrated Damascus for the Romans. So when they hit Damascus, okay, that's when Herod would have found out that there were Magi on the way. Because advance riders of some type, whether they were sent out by the Magi themselves or whether they were simply, an intelligence network, for Herod, they would have taken off for Caesarea and for Jerusalem and said, hey, there is a Parthian army on its way. You better get ready. So this is the historical context behind God Save the King, and why Herod was greatly troubled when the Magi showed up, because the legitimate king had been born. The legitimate king, the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the King of Israel, had been born, and just coincidentally, an entire army showed up to make sure he was going to be able to take his throne. Now, God had a slightly different plan. He planned on things being a little more secretive and a little more behind the scenes. He wasn't going to install his son, at a little over a year old as the king of Judea by the arm of the flesh. He was going to do it differently. But this is the backstory behind God Save the King, and I've really, frankly, just kind of scratched the surface, but it really changes the story, both at the micro level and at the macro level. This is an epic story involving the Romans and the Parthians and Judean royalty, and there is politics, and there's murder, and there's suicide, and there's intrigue, and it's all about God bringing his son into the world, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.
What a powerful teaching tonight. We're here with Brother Tim. Tim, how do you pronounce your last name? Kays or Keys?
Kais. Think of the I's in your head with a K in front of it.
Kais. I want to get that right.
Yes, sir.
What a powerful teaching tonight, my brother.
Thank you.
What shall we title this for the archive tonight?
Well, I mean, you could simply entitle it "God Save the King," or because that's really what it is. It is "God Save the King." You could also entitle it, the political background of the Nativity, or something like that.
Brother, I love this. Again, Evangelist Tim Kai is here with us. Give out your website and any other contact information you'd like to. Anything you'd like to promote.
Absolutely. So my website is very simply www.godsavetheking.org. So please go to my website. Please get on my mailing list. I also have a YouTube channel that is simply entitled God Save the King. And if you want to reach out to me directly, the email address is very simply contact.godsavetheking@gmail.com, because I'd love to hear from you. I'd love feedback on what you think of the story. I realize for a lot of people this is going to ruffle their feathers because it's not the tradition they've been used to. But as I keep saying, I think this is a stunning and amazing story. It's a product of about 35 years of research for me, and I love telling it to anybody who will listen.
I'm going to put this in the show notes. And folks, I encourage you to get over to Tim's website there and YouTube channel. How often are you putting videos up on YouTube?
Well, I put something out pretty much every week, because right now I'm actually doing a weekly show for the Truth Be Told Radio Network, our brother Kevin Gallagher. And so that's going out every week, and I put up the video every week for that. Plus, several years ago, I did an 8-part mini-series for television on God Save the King, and you can see that on YouTube.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Are you planning a book at any time?
Absolutely. That is my plan. I've got it divided up into 3 major segments: the Judean Chronicle, the Parthian Chronicle, and the Roman Chronicle. And I need to get the Judean Chronicle published first. That's the first one on the list. And then we're going to go for the Parthian Chronicle, because the Parthian Chronicle includes how to actually read the stars the same way the Magi did.
90 seconds.
Brother, that's exciting. Folks, again, go to godsavetheking.org. You can catch him on YouTube and also Truth Be Told Radio Network. Tim, we've got to get you on every month. Do you have the possibility to come back on in December?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay, great. I'll be working on a schedule soon, and we'll contact you. And let's set up some more dates to keep this thing going. It'd be an honor to have you.
Absolutely. I'd appreciate that.
Tim, God bless you, and thank you to Dr. Del Sides for connecting us with
60
Brother Tim
seconds.
Kais. We'll see you soon, brother.
All right. God bless you.
Great word tonight. Great audio.